Hi there, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast. I'm your host, Philip Eidson, and this week I'm joined by two guests, Amanda Prochaska and Jonathan Townsley. Well, Amanda has had a diverse career in procurement, working in leadership positions for companies such as Conagra, the Kellogg Company, Kraft Heinz, and most recently MGM Resorts. Earlier this year, Amanda founded her own company, High Performance Procurement, or HPP, and the focus of HPP is really on providing supplier development programs and increasing supplier performance. Jonathan also has a background in procurement leadership roles at companies like Eaton, Ingersoll Rand, and New Seasons Market, and he works closely with Amanda at HPP. So in today's episodes, we explore the topic of supplier development, including how procurement can assist suppliers that are at risk of being replaced due to poor performance. And then we deep dive into what steps procurement can take to get a truly effective supplier development program off the ground. And as I always do, I started the pod by asking Amanda and then Jonathan if they found procurement or procurement found them.
So I would say it's kind of a convoluted story, but I would say that I found procurement, and that is because I decided to study French and international business in college.
Okay.
And I found myself my junior year trying to think through actually what would I do with myself with that major. So I looked through a book that the international political economics major provided, and it was alphabetically sorted. And so I went through the A's and I didn't find anything that I was interested in, started going through the B's and came across buyer. And I was like, well, I kind of like to buy things. So I should probably look into that. So I researched on with a company who was French headquartered, and but had their North American headquarters right in my backyard. And believe it or not, they had a buyer position open, and I applied, got the position, and never looked back.
Yeah, interesting. So once you got in the profession, that's what happens to so many of us. You kind of stick with it.
Yeah, and I fell in love with something new happens every single day, and I felt like we just got to see so much of what happens within the companies we support. So I just love the dynamic aspect of what we do.
So, and Jonathan, what about your backstory? You've got a little bit of experience, I think, both in operational and supplier management roles as well. So how did you find yourself in procurement?
Yeah, to really answer your question, I would say that procurement found me. I started my career working in logistics management, freight forwarding, for a large company, Ingersoll Rand. And it was interesting. I enjoyed that because I got a lot of exposure to people in other parts of the world. And actually, that role was a little bit more than just logistics. It involved buying some componentry for products that we were assembling offshore in some of our plants that were in China, in Mexico, and Brazil. And the company decided they wanted to go through a strategic change and actually get more involved in the strategic development of the supply chain. And I was tapped to lead a data analytics team, and really came up through the ranks, starting from there. So definitely it found me, and I'm very glad that it did.
So how did the two of you end up working together? You know, I think I've known both of you independently of each other over the years since we've been doing Art of Procurement, just as active members of the community. So so what brought the two of you together?
LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So it was a digital relationship. So I actually I was very impressed with Jonathan's insights, his willingness to network. And what he also does so well is that he really invests time into getting to know the great people within our industry. So, and of course, I was impressed with the background and experiences that he was just going over in the first question. So we found ourselves with a common passion for supplier development and relationships. So we decided to work together.
Right. No, I was interested because, like I say, I've known both of you, I think, independently of each other through LinkedIn. It's amazing, isn't it, how we all feel like we know each other within the community. And I think we might have talked about this off mic as we were preparing for the call, kind of this spirit in procurement of everybody really being out there to try and help each other. And yet so many of us have never even met each other physically before.
Yeah, I would say the interesting thing about LinkedIn is that it has such a reach. And like you say, Phil, I've met many people, at least virtually, and known about them over the years, and just recently started meeting them personally, and it's been a great benefit, a great value. So I'm thankful that we were able to connect through LinkedIn. It's really a great tool.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because Jonathan and I actually started working together before we met each other face to face. We just recently met each other face to face in Atlanta, a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping, I'm sure that all of our conference schedules align next year, given the amount of time that you spend on the road at events and the amount of time I typically spend on the road at events, that we'll be able to do the same here as well. I wanted to dig down. You talked a little bit about supply development, and that was that shared passion for supply development that kind of brought you together. And that's the key topic that we're really here to talk about today. So as much as, the term supplier development on the face of it sounds straightforward, it's not necessarily a phrase that we hear about often within the procurement space. It's often supplier relationship management, for example. So how would you actually describe supplier development? How are you defining supplier development?
Yeah. So I would say foundationally, how I define it is simply knowing that when your suppliers perform at their best levels, procurement and the organizations, their stakeholders that they support, also perform at their best. So it's that whole philosophy around how are we maximizing the supplier's capabilities so that we can leverage them as our own. Yeah. How are we developing them to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace? How are we able to drive new innovations through their capability? So in my firm belief is that if done correctly, when it is done correctly, supplier development reduces your total cost of ownership. Yeah. It reduces risk. It increases innovation, increases agility within your supply chains. It sounds like everything that procurement has been focused on for so long. And it's just working in a different way outside of just the pure price negotiation to add value for our stakeholders and our organization.
We are trying to find ways to really add value and look beyond just your simple price negotiation. And I think that's actually what makes supplier development more fun, is that you can learn more about what makes the supplier tick, and you actually learn what makes you successful along those same lines. And I think putting those two things together, the supplier's capabilities and your team's capabilities, really can unlock some things that maybe you weren't looking for before. And it's certainly much more than just price.
So do you feel that, when it comes to developing your suppliers in that way, a lot of procurement organizations still kind of have a handoff when you sign the contract, and hand the contract over to the whoever the business stakeholder is, and you don't really get into what happens post contract. So I guess there's a couple of things. One that I just want to ask from a structural perspective is, does that require kind of us to rethink a little bit about the life cycle, like the procurement life cycle as it stands to how we work with the supplier, so we're actually more proactively getting involved post-contract?
Yeah, I believe there's a foundational shift, and it's going to be interesting to see how all of this evolves, because as I see technology coming into play, where a lot of what we do day in and day out might be automated. So I get a lot of questions in the marketplace. Well, if our jobs are automated, or what we're thinking we're doing today will be automated, what are we going to do in the future? And so where I see the kind of the pendulum swinging is that because of that automation and technology, it's going to free up bandwidth for procurement organizations to be more involved in those relationships and really become a knowledge center for the organization around all of the capabilities that their suppliers have. So then also what's going on in the marketplace, how could we be positioning and innovating our product differently? So I really see that there are a couple of those mega trends that are all interacting together to drive this shift within procurement to allow us to be more focused on the total life cycle of that relationship.
Yeah, and I even would second that to say I like the term knowledge center. I even like the term business partner more, and I think that's what procurement will become as we drive down some of these non-value added tasks or maybe tactical activities. We become more sought after as the trusted advisor. We can lead our stakeholders and business partners through decision-making process on which suppliers to choose because of their capabilities, their technology, their business philosophies, all those things. But we become the center of knowledge or the business partner focal point where we can guide our stakeholders through the life cycle of those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And it will be interesting to see how, as we continue to mature in those ways, how our incentives might change, the measurements of how we are measure our goals that we have each day, how all of those are going to change to be more focused on that overall life cycle and the value and the partnerships that we create both internally and externally.
Yeah, I think the first part of that is, we have to kind of sell. One thing is, we can never get away from blocking and tackling and doing the things that, an organization may expect from us today, because that's why they invested in procurement in the first place. So it's not like a sudden shift to another model, but I think it's on us to sell the art of the possible to the organization, because it's us that has set up, we've positioned procurement as being generally a cost reduction or a focusing on the bottom line rather than the top line function. And so it's on us to change the hearts and minds of people, both in showing that we can do things differently and showing how things like supply development connect to the top line, and then actually obviously delivering and executing on it. Because, I completely agree with what you're saying in terms of where procurement is going and the whole idea of the business partnering. To one extent, I feel like it's something we've been talking about for so long, but there are only so many procurement groups who have really succeeded in becoming that trusted advisor. To the point in what we do in our procurement transformation work, it's all about business partnering. How can we position procurement to be the partner, to be aligned with the organization? Because it feels to us that that's what's missing. So when it comes to, the relationship between procurement and suppliers, back in the day, I think it's fair to say that at least we had the mentality that for the most part, organizations could treat suppliers in whichever way they wanted, because ultimately we had the checkbook. That was the industry. I was brought up in the automotive industry for the first 3 or 4 years of my career. That was certainly the perspective in the auto industry. Do you feel that kind of power balance is shifting so that now it's really the suppliers that are starting to have the power in the relationship? That's not just when you're looking at it from a smaller organization, but some of the very biggest organizations as well. That ultimately that's the case. Suppliers are having more power than perhaps they've ever had before.
I certainly think that there is more of a lean that way, and I would say it's because of a couple of dynamics that are going on just in the world around us. First of all, labor markets are really tight right now. So as suppliers are looking at where they're providing their services or goods, they're being a little bit more strategic in those choices. But then there's also things like digital marketing, where suppliers have access to markets that they've never had access to before at very, very low cost. So they're able to reach and network and build relationships with many potential organizations at, like I said, just a very low cost structure versus what it was just a few years ago. And then suppliers are just extremely hungry to be collaborative right now. You're seeing a lot more millennial leaders that are seeking relationships where they can truly add value and drive innovation through a collaborative relationship. So in all of this, with suppliers that we're working with right now, they are putting their best people, they're putting forward their best products and services to those organizations who truly treat them in a collaborative way. So I definitely think there's a shift there. And I believe that we're going to just continue to see more of that.
So when you mentioned you're working with, you see suppliers who are really wanting to be collaborative, what do they look from the organizations who they choose to collaborate with? Because obviously they have a choice as well, especially if they're the more innovative suppliers. They can reach out to whoever they want, and there'll be some interest in partnering with them. So what can we do as a procurement organization to be that customer of choice for those most innovative suppliers?
Well, I think it's a great term, customer of choice. Actually, it's something I've been trained to be. And by that, I mean, I've always found ways to try to be more collaborative, like Amanda mentioned. Make sure that we at least pay the suppliers on time. Right. Some of the basics that would sort of invite them to engage. Because if you treat them like you want to be treated, I think you will get very good return. You will get their best ideas. You will get their A team or their best people servicing their account. And really, that's been my mindset. And the people that I work with, I try to train them. And I really think suppliers are looking for that customer of choice because easier to do business. They have more, I think, exchange of ideas, and it actually can help them with their own product development, their own business. Right. So I really see those types of relationships as partnerships, and they're becoming more prevalent.
Yeah, and what we're finding is that to create that relationship where you are the customer of choice, it doesn't take a whole heck of a lot of investment to be able to do it. It's simple behavioral changes, like, for instance, actually taking the time to ask a supplier who you want to build this type of relationship with how you can help them. And not just help them in your relationship, but help them succeed against their overall goals as a company. So that seems to, and then you obviously have to follow through on delivering that help. But that simple offer of a service, if you will, back to the supplier breaks down a lot of barriers. That helps build collaboration and build that trust. The other way that we're seeing it in the marketplace is that identify a business problem that you're trying to solve and pull in some of your high potential, high performing suppliers and have them help you solve that problem. The suppliers have so much capability out there that often we don't tap into. And my philosophy has always been, if you can get more and more people around the table to solve a business problem, you're going to get the best ideas and the best solutions. So, and as an outcome, like I said, that's a simple thing. It doesn't take all that much effort. And boy, does it change the dynamics within those relationships.
Simplicity is key, and we need to break the paradigm of such the one where we have a combative relationship or adversarial relationship to more open. And I like what Amanda said. If you simply ask them, how can we help you? I think that will take their guard down, and you will get a lot more than you actually bargained for in terms of their responses and ideas.
Yeah, it's actually amazing to me that so often when we're going out for RFP, for example, we are telling the suppliers what their solution should be, as opposed to actually talking to them and asking, like, here's the business problem that I have. How can you help me solve it? and getting lots of different ideas of how you can do that, which, because, we think that we're the experts, but we're not necessarily the experts in how their market works and the offerings that they can do. So I agree. I found where you start opening that, sometimes it's kind of they're taken a little back because they're not used to that approach. But suppliers have so many good ideas about how we as the buying firm can do things differently.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you are starting to think about, having a supply development program, and I'm going to differentiate this from a supplier relationship management program, where supplier relationship management, in my mind, you will look for the suppliers who are perhaps the biggest spend, or those that you want the tightest control over, or you want to be closest to from a performance management perspective. When you think about supplier development, it's not necessarily about all those things. As you said before, it's about what are some of the business challenges that you want to help develop suppliers to help you solve. Like, where do you decide like who should be in a supplier development program?
Oh, I love this question. And I have such a passion for it because I believe actually that there's a very close relationship between supplier development and supplier relationship management.
Mm-hmm.
And when we go into procurement organizations and they're kind of starting from scratch, or maybe they've had kind of a check the box supplier relationship program where they've segmented their suppliers, right, and they have quote unquote quarterly reviews, but it's not adding a whole heck of a lot of value. So where we usually start from is actually from a performance lens.
Mm-hmm.
And we say, hey, the segmentation around strategic and transactional, tactical had its run, but we actually recommend that we segment our suppliers like we would our own employees.
Okay.
So we look at suppliers like they're high potential suppliers, high performing suppliers. There might be some suppliers that are developing or a newer relationship. You're kind of still trying to figure it out. Some that you're just going to say they are what they are, and we're not going to really focus on them.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's some of the lower ends that might be at risk, either financially, they might have supply chain risk, they might have performance risk, and then you have your low performers. And what we have found was looking at your segmentation that way, it drives the relationship to have different conversations, and it also delivers against the development portion of that
right.
conversation. So you might bring in a high-performing supplier to help you solve that business problem, but you might put a low-performing supplier on an actual development plan,
mm-hmm.
right, to get them back
yeah.
on track. So that's how we like to look at it. But we've talked about supplier relationship management for so long within our industry, and from my perspective, it's made us marginally better
right.
at what we do. But if we can reframe that to say, look, we actually want to develop the suppliers so we have a more robust relationship with them, and they also have a more robust relationship with us, then I think we're going to accelerate the value that we can deliver.
Mm-hmm. So as you are coming into an organization, or as procurement is coming to its stakeholders and having the conversation with the business owners of a contract, I've often found that you coming to them and their position is, well, I know how to manage my supplier, and everything's fine. Why are you involved in this? How are you having that conversation to help the business owners of a contract kind of take a step back or relinquish some of their control, and partner with procurement to help develop the supply base?
I think in my experience here, I've generally just asked a few questions along the lines of some key metrics such as quality. Is your supplier giving you work that's mistake-free? And if it's filled with mistakes, how are they solving them, and how are you solving them together?
Mm-hmm.
And that would be one question. Another question I asked, are you satisfied with the pricing that you're getting? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it's no. But if it's no, I probe a little bit more to find out if they are actually looking for cost reductions, or maybe they're looking for some other type of value that may not be easily translated into a price. And by that, I mean, maybe they're looking for some way of engagement to get a better idea that can help their product management team get the products out to the market faster or quicker. And I also ask about things like innovation and idea generation. So as we continue with these conversations with our stakeholders, they actually find out that maybe they weren't asking all the right questions, or they weren't asking enough questions, but they get the sense that it really should be more of a conversation to learn more about what the supplier can do for the organization. And then they actually learn, what they can do to make the relationship better for themselves as well. So it's really a unique situation, but I always started out with a conversation and ask a few questions and let it flow from there.
Yeah. And I'll just add on, it's kind of an interesting thing. We have a couple of clients that we're working with right now, and they're trying to build out their procurement organization and break into new areas of support. And, in my experience, and this is a true story, one of the times that I was put in that type of position, I went into the IT organization and never once talked about price negotiations or doing RFPs or a purchase order or anything like that. I asked them about their strategies and where they were trying to go. And one of the issues that they were having was that they didn't have a cadence with their top suppliers of conversations, sharing strategies, understanding how they could work more effectively with each other. So I put in a structure around that. And after I was able to do that, then we were able to talk about, okay, I've earned their trust, I provided value, and then we started getting some more of the standard procurement work. So I think sometimes, especially when you're trying to break into that new relationship, understanding how a supplier could solve a problem or help them achieve their goals or help them obtain what they're looking for from a strategic perspective, that might be a really good way to build that relationship with that stakeholder.
So flip it to the other side, like how do suppliers, and I'm going to go to suppliers that need some development help. You talked about the continuum, looking at it from a HR and an employee development perspective. So those that are at risk, how do those suppliers take the invitation to build and develop a development plan with you?
We've had some very, very interesting conversations with suppliers. What I would say the first reaction is one of worry, one of questioning the motive. We sometimes get, is this just another way for procurement to come knocking on our door for price reductions? So we get the gamut, and usually it's not overly positive because their suppliers are frankly just not used to these kind of conversations. And the willingness of procurement to actually help develop them. So what I would say is that what we are doing in our conversations with the suppliers is that we start talking about mutual benefit. And a lot of these development programs, yes, they're beneficial for the buy-side organization that's asking for it and the supplier, but the supplier really gets the maximum benefit because now they can take what they have learned through this development program and achieve more success with their other customers. Right. They often increase their revenues. They often decrease their costs. And sometimes even through working with us, they're offering new products in the marketplace that they have now discovered. So that I think once the supplier understands that perspective, they are much more willing to engage with the sense that they're looking for continuous improvement to help meet their business goals.
Yeah, one of the worst things I've always found for when I was on the buy side is when you tell a supplier they're not performing and you're going to resource them and they had no clue that it was coming. And so, our stakeholders often do that to our suppliers, and it just gives them no way to rectify anything. And you think about all the cost involved in going and finding a new supplier and contracting with that supplier and onboarding that supplier.
Yep.
And everything that comes along with it. It's a huge financial, investment, even just for the smallest of suppliers because of all the man hours involved in it. So I can absolutely see kind of the benefit of let's try and get ahead of that and maybe save some relationships here rather than just when they're not performing for a little while, well, toss them out and we'll find somebody else instead.
Right. Yep, absolutely. And it's been an interesting conversation because, so often we do come across procurement professionals who are like, hey, if a supplier doesn't perform well, we just kick them out.
Right.
And so we talk about that cost of change because it's not just the disruption to the business and doing an RFP or going out to market. That all takes work and effort, but it's the long-term impact on the operations that's really costly. So now you have a stakeholder who needs to rebuild a relationship with that supplier. That supplier needs to learn us. And it is just much more effective if we just spend a little bit of time with that supplier to clarify expectations. It's very similar to what you would do with an employee who's not performing well. Yeah. Oftentimes that employee is not performing well because they don't have clarity around the expectation. I used to see that all the time in procurement where my stakeholders would come to me and they would say, supplier is performing poorly, and you would have a conversation with the supplier and the supplier's like, well, I didn't know that was the expectation. Right. Yeah. So having that open dialogue and getting on the same page and having an actual plan that we're working against where the supplier understands that there's a lot of benefit for them. We see rapid results from that type of an approach.
And Amanda, if I can go back to the concept that you had when you talked about where the supplier can learn an idea and apply it to their own business and their own customers. Yeah. I think that's important too in a way to disarm the feeling going in where we're going to just beat them up or take them of all the price or all the profit that they can earn. I think if they understand that it really is a collaboration and you have that trust, both groups can benefit and maybe even they can benefit more by applying it in a scalable way.
Yeah, it's interesting when we would do like value engineering, and this is in the more back to my days in the manufacturing space, and look at continuous improvement. When you're looking at taking cost out, you're looking at actually helping them improve their margins as well. So you're not there to just help them improve and then take 100% of the benefit, or at least the programs that are successful don't do that, because like you say, you want to help them too, because then they're vested in this program and they've put their best resources on it because it has a structural benefit for them.
Right.
I have a question. In fact, there's just a couple of questions before it's time to wrap up. But one of them is around, and it also talks to some experience that I've had in manufacturing. And I think I keep going back to manufacturing because that's really where supplier development is probably more of an understood and accepted kind of business practice, at least on the direct materials side. And in direct materials, we would often develop suppliers that didn't have business because we're trying to develop them up to a standard which would in some day in the future enable us to then give them business, or at least bring them into a competitive marketplace, because perhaps we just had a monopoly or a duopoly in a particular space and no leverage. So you'd invest a lot of money in developing a supplier so you had more of a competitive marketplace. I'm interested to understand whether you see that within the indirect, in the services side, where there's investment in supply development pre-sourcing, or whether this is really you've brought somebody in and now you want to get the most out of them.
Yeah, so I'm actually seeing it. We've had, and we haven't deployed anything yet, but we have a lot of conversations going on where, particularly in the supplier diversity space, where there are diverse suppliers, both on the direct and indirect area, but we're seeing actually a lot more indirect, where the suppliers are continually bidding for opportunities, but they're rarely winning them. Yeah. Or you have diverse suppliers who are they have a piece of the business, but they're struggling to grow and expand that business. So we're seeing some investments being made into those suppliers to help grow them so that they're more prepared to win a contract moving forward.
Yeah.
And it's a struggle in the diversity space because everyone's trying to grow their numbers.
Yeah.
But if you have certain location restrictions where you don't have a lot of diverse suppliers to choose from, you have to grow them.
Yeah, and you can have very tough contracting language, infosec requirements, insurance requirements, all those kind of things that,
right.
While you're trying to grow your diverse spend to a certain percentage of your overall spend, that is so restrictive for what is often smaller suppliers.
Yeah, and some of the suppliers that we're working with, they don't even know how to respond to the RFP, right? The RFP itself is so overwhelming that they're opting out. So, it is a struggle in that area. But, what we're seeing is that some of these small, mid-sized, and diverse companies, they're just so hungry and agile and willing to partner and collaborate that, they can be some of the best assets when you're thinking about how do I tap into that capability. They are some of the best ones to partner with.
Yeah, and they're going to customize, in a lot of cases, the value prop or the differentiator, the benefit that they'll bring, customize it entirely for you and build it from the ground up for you because, one, they want to build that relationship. Two, it obviously helps them in building their product, but you don't get that opportunity when you're working with more established companies who are saying, you know what, this is an off-the-shelf product and maybe we'll do a little bit of configuration, but that's it.
Right.
And that's where I actually think the typical procurement professional actually becomes a salesman because in many times you have to sell the value of these smaller suppliers or diverse suppliers within the organization and all the attributes and benefits that they can bring. They may not be readily visible, but that's really where it requires us to be creative and to almost adopt a sales-like approach to shepherd those suppliers, through an organization so that they can deliver that value.
And so my last kind of question is, we think about all the things we can do from a supply development perspective. And I think it somewhat ties right to the beginning when we talk about metrics and changing metrics and measurement for procurement function. It's around, how do you actually measure the ROI of an investment in supply development and a supply development program to make it attractive, to get the funds, because obviously doing this isn't, it's not for free. There's a lot of investment of people's time more than anything in getting a supply development program off the ground, but then doing the investment in the suppliers you need to develop.
Yeah. So it's a little bit harder to nail down sometimes. But what I would say is that what we're finding the most success with is identifying key performance indicators up front within these programs and particularly with the suppliers that you're engaging with, so you know exactly where they're starting from. And those KPIs can be, they can run the gamut, they could be quality, delivery, operations, accounts payable, whatever it is, innovation. So once you have that baseline, then it's a lot easier to measure the incremental improvement. Some of our clients are asking the suppliers for help with their innovation pipelines. They're asking for these selected suppliers to help them build out their cost savings pipelines. So all of those obviously can be measured too as a value of the program. So that's typically how we're seeing it. When an organization doesn't want to do the KPIs right up front with their suppliers, it's definitely what I would consider more story-based, which I don't think we should overlook. Some of these stories are very powerful. In fact, we've had a couple of customers who have used these stories, particularly with diverse suppliers, in their corporate social responsibility reports every year. So it could be a really a great way to show the value of procurement and how procurement is having a positive impact in the communities around them. So I see it two ways: the having the KPIs and measure those, but then the stories that come out of this type of relationship are very, very powerful.
Yeah, I think that in some ways like opening the mindset to what the impact is that you can have from programs like this. Because I want to jump on something you said there, because I've got a very similar experience, with a client that we have, and it's about embracing smaller suppliers within the community so that you can use that as a marketing tool, because it's a very regional, like localized business. You're actually investing back in the local community. That is something you can use to grow the business. You're not necessarily looking at it to say, I'm going to save a bunch of money, but actually I'm going to grow the top line. And, one of the things that I've learned for sure is that there is so much more power when we're talking about the value of any program that procurement does in how it actually leads to growth, as opposed to, reducing costs a little bit. Not to say, again, that's not important, but at the end of the day, executives in a typical organization want to invest in growth rather than just kind of cut their way to success.
Right.
Yeah, and I think what you said, Phil, is important, because many companies today are trying to differentiate themselves. And one way to do that is to say they're really involved in the community, really lifting up the local supplier community. And those types of stories, I think, really resonate with the client and customer base. So I do believe what you and Amanda say is correct, is that sometimes the storytelling, while overlooked, it can be very powerful.
Yeah. Well, I know it's about time to wrap up, so my last question is always the easiest question. First of all, I want to thank both of you, Amanda and Jonathan, for joining me today. And the question is just, and I'll start, Amanda, with you. How can listeners reach out, connect with you, find you, learn a little bit more if their interest in supplier development has been piqued by our conversation today?
Yeah, and I guess I'll start at the beginning. LinkedIn, I'm very active on LinkedIn, so I would love to connect with anyone on LinkedIn and have that continued dialogue. Otherwise, they can reach me at my email address, which is amanda.prochaska@hppcoach.com. You'll see and out, at least out on my LinkedIn, that there's a lot of content out there on the topic.
Yep.
Very similar for me.
Okay.
I'm very active on LinkedIn. I really enjoy what the platform has become. I think people used to think of it just as a way to find job opportunities, but I think it's become so much more in that you can connect with people, share ideas, learn, and grow. And so I invite really any of the listeners to connect with me there. And I just would enjoy continuing the conversation.
Okay, great. Well, what I'll do is I'm going to include links to both of your profiles on LinkedIn on our show notes page. Just go to artofprocurement.com/podcast, and there's a search functionality there, and search for supplier development, and you'll find the show notes for today's episode. So we'll make sure that everything is included. Jonathan and Amanda, I just want to thank you one last time for joining me today. Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.